In 1968, as Britain watched its once mighty automotive industry hemorrhaging market share to German and Japanese competitors, the government orchestrated what they believed would be the ultimate salvation. Four struggling car companies, British Motor Holdings, Leyland Motor Corporation, Jaguar, and Rover, were merged into a single industrial giant called British Leyland Motor Corporation. With backing from Tony Benn's Department of Industry and promises of streamlined production, this new entity controlled 40% of the UK car market overnight and employed over 170,000 workers across dozens of factories. The merger created Europe's second-largest automaker, producing everything from humble Austin Minis to luxury Jaguars under one corporate umbrella. British Leyland was meant to be Britain's answer to Ford and General Motors, a national champion that would restore the country's automotive supremacy. Instead, it became a cautionary tale of how industrial policy, labor militancy, and corporate mismanagement could destroy an entire sector. What followed was 18 years of strikes, quality disasters, and political interference that would ultimately kill not just British Leyland, but Britain's dreams of remaining a major car-producing nation. The seeds of British Leyland's destruction were planted in its very DNA. The hasty 1968 merger threw together companies with completely different corporate cultures, overlapping model ranges, and incompatible manufacturing systems. Austin and Morris had been bitter rivals for decades, yet suddenly their engineers were expected to collaborate on new designs. Jaguar's craftsmen, accustomed to hand-building luxury cars, found themselves grouped with mass production specialists from Leyland's truck division. The result was operational chaos. British Leyland inherited 23 different engine types, dozens of redundant factories, and a management structure where former competitors now sat around the same boardroom table plotting strategy. Donald Stokes, the former Leyland chief executive who became British Leyland's first managing director, admitted years later that nobody truly understood the complexity of what they had created. The company was producing over 50 different car models simultaneously, many competing directly with each other in the same market segments. Meanwhile, quality control suffered as production systems designed for different manufacturing philosophies were awkwardly bolted together. Within 2 years of the merger, British Leyland was already showing signs of the institutional dysfunction that would plague it for the next decade and a half. The labor troubles that would define British Leyland's reputation began almost immediately, but reached their peak during the militant 1970s when the company became Britain's strike capital. Derek Robinson, nicknamed Red Robbo by the tabloid press, emerged as the most visible symbol of this industrial warfare during his time as shop steward at the massive Longbridge plant in Birmingham. Between 1968 and 1979, British Leyland lost in staggering 4.2 million working days to strikes, walkouts, and work-to-rule campaigns, more than any other British company in any industry. The Cowley plant in Oxford was shut down by strikes for 127 days in 1970 alone, while Longbridge experienced over 500 separate industrial disputes during the 1970s. These weren't just wage disputes. Workers struck over tea break timing, toilet paper quality, the temperature in workshops, and even the right to read newspapers during lunch. In 1974, production at the Speak plant in Liverpool was halted for 3 weeks because workers objected to a new clocking-in system. The strikes created a vicious cycle where delayed deliveries drove customers away, reducing revenue and forcing cost-cutting measures that triggered more industrial action. British Leyland's reputation for unreliability became so notorious that fleet buyers began avoiding the company entirely, knowing that delivery schedules were essentially meaningless. Dealers reported customers walking out of showrooms when told their new car might take 6 months to arrive due to production difficulties. As strikes crippled production, British Leyland's cars developed an equally damaging reputation for shocking build quality that made the company's name synonymous with mechanical failure across the globe. The Austin Allegro, launched in 1973 as a mass-market family car, became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Its square steering wheel was widely mocked, its hydrogous suspension system failed regularly, and early models suffered from doors that wouldn't close properly and engines that leaked oil from the factory floor. Quality control had become so lax that British Leyland dealers routinely spent hours fixing new cars before they could be sold to customers. The Marina model, despite selling over 800,000 units, was plagued by rust problems so severe that 3-year-old cars were literally falling apart on British roads. Consumer Magazine, which found that British Leyland cars were 3 times more likely to break down than equivalent models from Ford or Vauxhall. Even the company's premium Jaguar brand wasn't immune. The XJ6 luxury sedan suffered from electrical problems so complex that Jaguar dealers kept a full-time specialist just to diagnose starting issues. Workers at British Leyland factories, demoralized by constant strikes and management upheaval, simply stopped caring about the quality of the cars they were building. Inspectors reported finding soft drink cans welded inside door panels, and one notorious incident saw a completed car rolling off the production line with the driver's seat installed backwards. By the mid-1970s, British Leyland's quality reputation was so toxic that export sales collapsed completely in key markets like the United States and West Germany. The company's financial situation became increasingly desperate as strikes and quality problems destroyed its customer base, forcing the Labour government to step in with taxpayer bailouts that ultimately totaled over £2 billion in today's money. In 1975, British Leyland was technically bankrupt and only survived through emergency nationalisation by Harold Wilson's government, which viewed the company as too important to British employment to be allowed to collapse. The Ryder Report, commissioned to assess British Leyland's future, recommended massive investment in new facilities and worker participation in management decisions, essentially rewarding the very militancy that had caused the crisis. Government ownership, however, only made things worse by introducing political considerations into business decisions. Ministers regularly interfered with plant closure plans and model development to protect jobs in marginal constituencies, while union leaders gained direct access to government ministers to bypass company management entirely. Michael Edwards, brought in as chairman in 1977 to turn the company around, later described trying to manage British Leyland as like performing surgery while the patient is having a heart attack. The company was burning through government subsidies so quickly that Treasury officials calculated British Leyland was costing taxpayers the equivalent of building a new hospital every month. Even with unlimited government backing, British Leyland's market share continued to plummet from 40% in 1968 to just 15% by 1980, as customers simply refused to buy cars from a company that couldn't guarantee they would work. Everything came to a head in 1979 when Michael Edwards decided to confront the militants head-on by firing Derek Robinson and demanding an end to the strike culture that was killing the company. Robinson's dismissal triggered a massive walkout at Longbridge involving 30,000 workers, but this time, public opinion had shifted decisively against the strikers as ordinary Britons grew tired of subsidizing industrial chaos with their tax money. Margaret Thatcher's new Conservative government made clear they would not intervene to save jobs, marking the beginning of the end for British Leyland's traditional way of doing business. The strike collapsed after 4 weeks when workers realized the government was serious about letting the company fail rather than continue indefinite subsidies. Edwards used his victory to close 13 factories, eliminate 100,000 jobs, and completely restructure British Leyland's operations around a smaller number of viable models. The Austin Metro, launched in 1980, represented a final attempt to recapture the mass market with a modern, well-built small car that could compete with the Ford Fiesta and Volkswagen Polo. Despite positive reviews and initial strong sales, the Metro's success came too late to save British Leyland's reputation. Customers who had been burned by Allegros and Marinas in the 1970s were simply unwilling to give the company another chance, while fleet buyers had already switched permanently to Ford and imported brands. The damage to British Leyland's brand was irreversible, and even genuinely improved products couldn't overcome 2 decades of industrial chaos and quality disasters. The final chapter in British Leyland's story came during the 1980s as Margaret Thatcher's government systematically dismantled the company through privatization and the sale of individual brands to foreign buyers. The process began in 1984 when Jaguar was floated as an independent company on the London Stock Exchange, removing British Leyland's only genuinely premium brand. Land Rover and the Rover car division were sold to British Aerospace in 1988 for £150 million, a fraction of what taxpayers had invested in developing these brands during the government ownership period. The truck and bus operations became Leyland DEF through a joint venture with the Dutch company DEF, while the Austin and Morris brands were simply abandoned as commercially worthless. By 1986, British Leyland Motor Corporation had been formally dissolved, its assets scattered among foreign owners who gradually moved production overseas. The Longbridge plant, once the heart of British car manufacturing with 30,000 workers, was sold to BMW along with the Rover brand, but closed permanently in 2005 when the German company decided British manufacturing was no longer viable. Today, the sprawling Longbridge site is a shopping center and housing development, with only a small museum remaining to commemorate what was once Europe's largest car factory. The British car industry never recovered from British Leyland's collapse. By 2020, the UK produced fewer cars than it had in 1950, despite having a much larger economy and population. British Leyland's spectacular failure destroyed far more than just one company. It killed Britain's entire automotive ecosystem and demonstrated how industrial militancy could make an entire nation uncompetitive in global markets. The component suppliers, tool makers, and engineering firms that had supported British car manufacturing for decades either closed down or moved operations abroad when their biggest customer disappeared. Cities like Birmingham, Coventry, and Oxford lost their industrial identity almost overnight, transforming from centers of engineering excellence into service economies dependent on government employment and financial services. The psychological impact was equally devastating. British Leyland's collapse coincided with the broader deindustrialization of the 1980s, contributing to a national sense that Britain could no longer compete in manufacturing against more disciplined competitors from Germany and Japan. The company's reputation for strikes and poor quality became a global symbol of British economic decline, referenced by business schools around the world as an example of how not to run an industrial enterprise. Politicians across the political spectrum drew different lessons from the disaster. Conservatives argued it proved that government interference and powerful unions were incompatible with modern manufacturing, while Labour politicians insisted that proper investment and industrial strategy could have saved British Leyland if applied earlier and more systematically. The truth was probably simpler. By 1968, the British car industry was already too fragmented and uncompetitive to survive against larger, more efficient rivals, and the British Leyland merger merely delayed the inevitable reckoning by a decade and a half. The legacy of British Leyland's failure continues to influence British industrial policy and labor relations nearly 4 decades after the company's dissolution. Modern British politicians remain deeply skeptical of large-scale industrial interventions, having watched £2 billion of taxpayer money disappear into the British Leyland black hole with nothing to show for it except closed factories and unemployed workers. The company's experience demonstrated that government ownership, rather than providing stability and long-term planning, often made commercial problems worse by introducing political considerations into business decisions and removing the discipline of market forces. Trade unions, too, learned harsh lessons from British Leyland's collapse. The strike tactics that had been effective in the 1960s and early 1970s proved counterproductive when applied to companies facing genuine foreign competition rather than protected domestic markets. The transformation of British manufacturing from a unionized, strike-prone sector into today's largely non-unionized, foreign-owned industry can be traced directly to the traumatic experience of British Leyland and other industrial failures of the 1970s and 1980s. Perhaps most tragically, British Leyland's collapse wasted some of the most innovative automotive engineering talent in the world. The same designers and engineers who created disaster-prone cars like the Allegro later went on to develop successful vehicles for foreign manufacturers, proving that British technical capability was never the real problem. The company that was meant to save British car manufacturing instead became its executioner, transforming the UK from a major automotive producer into a branch plant economy where foreign companies assemble cars designed and engineered elsewhere. British Leyland's 18-year death spiral stands as one of the most comprehensive industrial failures in modern economic history, a cautionary tale about what happens when political ambition, labor militancy, and corporate incompetence combine to destroy an entire industry.